What's up guys, Jason Pickett and welcome back to Occult to Digital. Today we are talking about one of my favorite tips that I came across on the World Wide Web that I now use every single time I whip out the camera. And that is shooting at 30 frames per second. I know, it's crazy, it's non-traditional, it's not common, it really makes absolutely no sense, but I'm going to explain a little bit of why I have found a liking for 30 frames per second and why I now solely shoot in 30 frames per second if I am going for a cinematic look. When I would have normally been using 24 frames per second, I am now using 30 frames per second. Any time that I would have normally used 24 frames per second, I now use 30 frames per second as my standard. I will still bounce back between 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second, depending on if I'm using any slow motion in post or anything like that. But typically I'm shooting in 30 frames per second, and here is why. Reason number one. I shoot on the Zhiyun Crane V1, so the original Zhiyun Crane V1. And if you use a gimbal, any sort of gimbal, no matter the price range, there's these micro shakes that can happen depending on certain movements that you're doing. Whether you're walking really fast or running, or even sometimes just panning back and forth. I've noticed with mine, it'll run into weird little kinks, and some of that will show in post. So what I have found is that shooting in 30 frames per second and then putting that 30 frames per second clip into a 24 frames per second sequence in Premiere, it gets rid of a lot of those micro jitters or micro shakes that tend to happen. So I'm gonna pop up an example right now of a clip in 24 frames per second as well as a clip in 30 frames per second. They're both in a 24 frames per second timeline. No post stabilization has been applied at all. And this is just using my stabilizer. So as you can see, it's not a huge drastic difference, but for me, I have noticed a little bit of clarity and a little bit more stabilization by using 30 frames per second. Reason number two. That reason is going to be the clarity that I receive from using 30 frames per second and then popping it into a 24 frames per second timeline. Again, this is not a huge amount. I'm not talking world-changing, earth-shattering changes in the quality of your videos, but you will see a little bit of a difference between shooting in 24 frames per second into a 24 frames per second timeline, as opposed to shooting in 30 frames per second and popping that into a 24 frames per second timeline. There's a little bit of differences in some of the things, obviously, because you have those 6 more frames to work with, which again is not a ton, but it does add a little bit of clarity while still keeping that traditional cinematic look that people go for, and the reason why people shoot in 24 frames per second. Reason number 3 is the fact that sometimes I like to do slow motion, but not to the extent of 60 frames per second. So 30 frames per second still gives me a little bit of flexibility to slow things down a bit. Maybe not drastically apparent to the viewer, but maybe I'm trying to drag something out a little bit more, or just add a little bit of a more cinematic take to my shoot. I can use 30 frames per second to do that. So I can pop it again into that 24 frames per second timeline. I can knock it down 8–10%. And I'm still getting a little bit of a more drawn out look, but it's not as excessive as 60 frames per second can sometimes be. So those are the 3 reasons why I like to use 30 frames per second. Again, this is something that I tried because I saw something online, and I've come to really enjoy it. It gives me that little bit of extra clarity, a little bit of extra crispiness to my videos, especially when I'm shooting dancers. And it gives a little bit more stabilization to my crane, which already does a fantastic job. So we're gonna hop over to the computer really fast, and I'm just gonna kind of take you through exactly the process that I would do to take a 30 frames per second clip and put it into a 24 frames per second timeline. If you are an expert at Premiere Pro, this is going to be very boring for you. But if you're new to videography, you're new to video editing, this may be something that you can use, and maybe something that will inform you and give you a little bit more information on what I'm talking about. So let's hop over to the computer and check that out. Alrighty guys, so we're in Premiere Pro, we've got our test project pulled up, and we're gonna go ahead and import a clip from a recent shoot that I did. It was actually recording some class footage of myself. So we're gonna pull this into Premiere Pro. And if we right click and click on properties, we can see that this clip is in fact frame rate 29.97 frames per second, 30 frames per second. And now what I'm typically gonna do is right click in my project box, select new item and sequence, and I have a 24 frames per second custom preset already set up here. There's nothing fancy about this at all. It's 1080p, 24 frames per second. I'm gonna go ahead and click OK, and that's gonna create my sequence over here. From there, I'm just gonna go ahead and drag my clip on here, and when this pop-up comes up, it's gonna say clip mismatch warning. This clip does not match the sequence settings. Change sequence to match the clip settings. I'm gonna go ahead and click keep existing settings so that this remains 24 frames per second. And now I've dropped my 30 frames per second clip into a 24 frames per second timeline. So that's it, super simple, super straightforward. That's how I use 30 frames per second. Let's hop back over to the front and we'll see you there. Alrighty guys, thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you took something away. And let me know in the comment section below what you think. Do you like 30 frames per second? Have you used 30 frames per second? What do you normally shoot in? Because I would love to hear what you guys are doing and your take on the situation. Stay tuned, be sure to subscribe and like the video. I'm gonna be trying to post every single week, if not more. So next week, I'll see you here back again. Same place, talking about something new.